Welcome today. As always, our goal of IL MathCom is to spread the joy, wonder, and mathematics along with the organizations that we work with, like NCTM, NCSM, ASSM, ICTM. All of them are fun. So today what we are doing is we are talking about formative assessment. Hopefully you were able to join us on the first one. Several of you I recognize as being on the first one. And if you weren't, hopefully you had time to watch it. And if you didn't, I still think there will be plenty of good information here for you to keep active and engaged in the conversation. So I am Heather Brown. I work with the State Board of Education through a grant with ISU through the Center of Educational Initiative something. And Janine, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Janine Shepard. I'm a math and science content specialist.
I am going to add a few things to right now the chat window. If you have not already been paying attention, the chat window is kind of fun and active today, saying hello to everyone. But I'm going to put a few links for you to join. So there is the forum link, which is where we will keep information, different sites that people have said, links to the Google folder that we've talked about will be there. Also, if you did not hear about this from our listserv, I encourage you to join our listserv that's there. And if you are social media friendly and want to tweet about this or post about it on Facebook, we have highlighted our Twitter and Facebook pages so you can see them. I also said here's a link to the post survey, but I didn't copy it. So we'll get that to you towards the end of the session. I actually didn't mean to copy that sentence. And then I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to, I'm going to introduce, did I let you talk, Janine? You did, right? Okay. And I'm going to introduce Cheryl Toby, who is a math specialist from Maine, and she has been working on formative assessment for years through multiple positions. And she came at the beginning of January and helped us talk about how to take things from the summative assessment, like PARCC for us, and turn it into a formative assessment probe that actually showed students thinking. And now today we're going to talk a little bit about what to do next. So Cheryl, I'll let you take it over from here.
All right, thank you. It's good to be back. So I am going to share my screen and use a few slides for a few minutes. All right, so can you see that? Is that the, yes, okay, good. All right, so this is, as Heather said, this is part 2 because last time we really just talked about what is a formative assessment probe and how can we use our released items in a formative probe format. And so just as a recap before we talk about some of your experiences and looking at some of the student work that was collected, just remind folks from the last session, one of the things that we've been doing in Maine is really trying to shift our use of sample and released items from let's practice the test, kind of like it's 10 days before the test and it's now the boot camp of test taking and let's practice all the items that we possibly can so that you are ready for this assessment. And, you know, I'm speaking for the teachers that I work with on a regular basis because that's how they describe it to me, that's how they feel like there's this pressure to practice and not sure how to do it in a better way. And so we started working on these formative probes so that we could change this idea from just test-taking skills and practice to really this assessment for learning and to develop concepts throughout the year and embed them in our instruction. And so we have actually just finished our second round of assessment sessions around the state of Maine. So I was at the top of the state just yesterday, and we are doing the same conversation all across the state with K-12 teachers. And so we're excited that we're getting so much interest in using the ideas, and so we're so happy that we can share them across other states as well. So as a reminder, these formative probes, again from my work at using National Science Foundation money and other funding through nonprofit in research, we developed this idea of a formative assessment probe. Some of you may know, if you're in science, you may know Paige Keeley, who has a numerous number of resources on science formative probes. Paige and I worked together at the Maine Math and Science Alliance, and we paralleled this process in mathematics where we could take these selected response items and really put together these items that would be a way to get at misconceptions that we know exist on a regular basis. And by adding the explain the thinking prompt, we really are able to get at students thinking in a way that we only can make assumptions if all we do is give the multiple choice item. So that background of that work led into this idea of using these probes with an ACT cycle. And the ACT cycle is that we get together, and a lot of individual teachers are doing this, but it's so much more fun when we get a group together and talk about what's the math, what's the distractors, why might a student choose C, and then to actually give the item to say, what did they do when they chose C? What's interesting and what makes us curious about these students' thinking? And then what are we going to do about it? So we need to take action. And so we have developed these processes around the ACT cycle so that we're not just doing the boot camp, hey, let's all practice this assessment. And I can actually remember, so I started my teaching career in Washington State, and they call it the WASSL. And I can remember that directive from our department, our math curriculum committee and math curriculum coordinator, who said, we will be doing WASSL Wednesdays. So every Wednesday will be WASSL released items. And that was like this directive. And so how do we make these really useful? So the last time we really focused on this part of analyzing the math and consider students' thinking. And the second part of this evening, we'll really talk a little bit more about that taking action. But as a reminder, you had several choices, or you can make your own, but it's the idea is to take PARCC released items or PARCC sample items and either cluster them together or create a probe that will help us learn about students' thinking. And so this grade 4 example was one that I gave my teachers here in Maine in preparation for this session because they are, even though it's PARCC, we don't use PARCC, these are items that we would very typically see on our state assessment anyway. So I had asked some teachers to partake in our little ACT cycle, and I asked them to provide me some student work that they thought was interesting. And one of them sent me, get this. So I'm going to focus just on the last question. So the second question was, which fraction comparison is correct? So you can see those A, B, C, D choices. And what she decided to send along for our what was interesting to you was 3 students who all chose A on the second item, but for very different reasons. And this was really interesting to her. So I'll give you a moment to look at these. What do you notice? And you can use the chat if you would like. Just what do you notice about how all these are so different, even though they all chose A? And does anyone want to share anything that they're noticing?
I'm kind of surprised that the top students still arrived at A. Like based on the
but their unit size isn't the same.
Right.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The student has the issue where not paying attention to the same size whole. And so how do they use that representation to then decide? Why do you think she chose A is bigger than 4? 8 is bigger than 4. We don't like our R's in Maine. Why would do you think she chose this one as an interesting example?
Well, it looks like that second student is doing the same thing as the third student and finding that mean value in between.
Yeah, so this 8, where did the 8 come from? So she just thought this was really interesting. Where's 8? Where's 4? And we had this great conversation about where did that come from? So we did decide that the student has what's called that gap reasoning error misconception. So we have the whole thinking error, and here's a gap reasoning error where it's 12 subtract 4 is 8, and 6 subtract 2 is 4, and a really clear find the difference between the two and which one has the biggest gap. And then that last one, again, they're both a quarter. And so is that similar to the gap reasoning? They've got all this skip counting. And why didn't they choose equal here, right? So it was, these were just really fun conversations. And I think that's what one of our takeaways with this work is that we can engage in some really great conversations about students' thinking and where it comes from and what are the different errors. And she also picked these errors because we had just talked about the common misconceptions around comparing fractions. And so she had this eye for, hey, I'm going to find some, do I see these in my students' work? And she thought it was so interesting that she clearly saw the misconceptions. But bringing back the student work and talking about the student work is just really such a engaging conversation. One of the things that our teachers tell us all the time is that when they do get to engage in conversations around student work, it's almost always for scoring purposes. So let's get together and score this common assessment. What's the score in this pre-assessment or whatever it is? But it's always about scoring and rubrics and not just about what are we seeing in our students' work and how are we going to think about our instruction tomorrow because of what we're seeing. And I think that's the shift that's so exciting to hear and see in the work that we're doing. So we really just wanted a little bit of brief amount of time at the beginning just to kind of situate the work. I know that you were also asked to send if you had some student work that you found interesting. And I wanted to share with you what the teachers I had worked with around just prepping for this session using park items, what an example was that we talked about. So now it is really your turn, and this is when we may stay together, we may break out. I'll let Heather or Janine decide that, but I'll let you take it from here, and I'll stop sharing so that we can.
We're going to go ahead and break out, and one school has 4 people, and we're going to break you into two and two, so you'll both hear part of the conversation. So I believe K4 is going to stay here. And Janine just gave us the link if you are grade 5 and up, or some of you, like I said, if you gave more than one grade, we just kind of put you in one. You can go to the other room. And then Janine, you have the ones to share?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. I kept you in my room, and Anne, I kept you in the K4 room as well. Would you prefer to be in here or in the 5 and up?
Nope, this is great.
Okay. And then Monica, we weren't sure which Monica you were. So I kept you in the K4 room, but just send me a chat or unmute yourself and let me know if you would rather be in the 5 and up room. Okay. So, and that goes for any of you. If any of you would rather be in the 5 and up, just tell me and I can send you there very easily. All right, I am going to share. We're going to look. Monica, are you wanting to go to the other room?
Yes, please.
Yes, no problem. And Venetia. All right, let me send you. Okay. There you go. All right, all you have to do is opt in. All right, I'm going to share my screen so we can look at this work together. Okay, so we have 2 prompts here. We have a 4th grade prompt looking at a line plot. And then I wonder if I can change the view so we could look at this. And then the other one is a 2nd grade prompt that is looking at division. Let me change the view so that we can see these 4th grade responses side by side. All right. Oh, of course. That's not going to play out correctly, is it? Oh. There we go. Okay, there's the 2 pages of 4th grade. All right, so we have 3 responses that we can look at. What do you notice? What does this tell you about the student thinking?
And Janita is the teacher who sent this work on with us tonight?
That I don't know.
Okay.
Is that Hillary's? Okay, good. I'm so glad. Thank you. I have been consumed by a transitional math project for the last 24 hours, so I've been AWOL.
No problem. But I'd love to hear like Hillary's take on like why these particular student pieces that might help us kind of focus on what to look at.
Well, I think that one of them, I think it's G, was looking at the frequency of each jar, like how many halves, how many 3/4, and I think that they misunderstood what the question was asking, or they didn't understand, they didn't have a true understanding of analyzing a line plot. I think it's the one where, I think it's G, where it says that 1/4 is the smallest and 2/4 is the largest. They don't mean quantity largest, smallest, they mean frequency, like the number of X's. But that doesn't make sense because they could have chosen this, these 2 are equal. Yeah. I think the bottom line is our teachers spend more time on creating line plots and then analyzing line plots. So when you get an analyzing question, they don't always know what to do.
I agree. It's a tricky question because you see a line plot and you expect the question to be about the frequency, right?
Right.
Well, that's usually what you use a line plot for.
Right.
It seems like that they're not, assessing on, like I'm curious what standard they're trying to assess there. It looks more around the fractions. But versus kind of the line plot. But I think you're right when they are trying to look at the largest and they look at how many cups, how many have 2/4 of a cup, and not really understanding that that's just a quantity there.
And then I had one student, not one of these, who took issue with the grammar of the question and did, it says the amount in the smallest jars, plural, and the largest jars, plural. He thought he then had to add up all of that. And then when he did that, his answer wasn't there. And he was being, I don't know if he was being persnickety or too focused on wrong details, or trying, I don't know. But they definitely need more experience with analyzing.
Oh, you know what? So it's interesting. This just kind of hit me with F. I think anyway that there was a difference between the amount of water the largest jars, holds. So the largest jars are 3/4 and 1. And the smallest, I mean, technically would be, I don't know, 1/4 and 1/2. So now it makes me sense, I think, how because I could not understand initially how they were actually getting at that number.
So it seems like they know a lot more than what we would have found out by just them circling one cup, right? How they're interpreting the item is really interesting to me.
And I mean, technically F is correct because it is plural. And so they took the largest and the two smallest. So that's really good for us. Like, I just took the question as is and I didn't analyze it. But it makes me realize that it's really important that we analyze our questions, especially because our school has so many ELL students that it says plural and they did plural.
Yeah. I love these 3 pieces of work. All 3 of them are interesting in different ways.
All right, shall we, any other comments on this one? Shall we move on to the other?
Does this maybe give us a chance to recognize the quality of the question? Because I'm still struggling trying to figure out which one would be the right answer, because I could see student F and student H.
Right, I would see, I know as from my time in the classroom that I would have ended up granting, as long as they had a good argument, I probably would have been granting them the credit, right?
Right, but then on the actual assessment, they don't get the credit, right? Because it's just a multiple choice. And so it's, I think it's a great point because it just allows you, when you look at the assessment item, and we can have lots of debates in Maine around whether teachers like the item or not, and we do have those debates. But what we then say is, okay, so when we're doing these in our classroom, how is our program wording this? How are we wording this? And it's not until you see how important the wording is, that's what makes us think about, well, how are we wording it? And, or are we allowing them to see different ways of wording the same types of questions? And so it's really interesting. We had a whole session where people wanted to make their own, right? Because there's only so many sample and released items. And we had this whole discussion on how hard it is to word these once you have to word them. And so, and so that's been a fun thing to do together as well in Maine.
Cheryl, does Park have item specs that they can write questions from?
And Janine, that's probably a question for you.
That is actually a Heather question. Okay. Repeat the question to make sure that we ask that back in the main room. Her, like 90% of her position is park related.
Okay.
Yeah, so she is our park guru. But repeat it so that we make sure we get it asked.
Yeah, I'm just curious if they have item specs.
Yeah.
I know the Smarter Balance, that literally the question prompt is written out, and for the level of DOK, the target or the standard, and then you can just kind of absolutely repeat the question with different numbers.
Excellent. We will ask Heather when we go back to whole group. All right. Let's look now at this division probe and see what we think.
This was actually a 3rd grade problem in the data bank that was shared with us, but I gave it to 2nd grade because it's what we teach in 2nd grade.
Ah, interesting. So I recognize this problem from the main database. And so I have, I've seen very similar work across the state on, from what you're showing here.
I think J is very common when children don't know what to do at a young 2nd, 3rd grade age. They usually default to addition. I see that a lot. And then, you know, drawing a picture, especially at the 2nd grade level, is a really great strategy that, you know, we try to stress in our teaching. And that was, I think that was what helped that child be successful, although I have a feeling that child just knew the fact.
And we've actually talked a lot about this item in Maine because what teachers are saying is that when they give these kinds of problems in the classroom and they talk about their pictures and their representations, they're not always necessarily bringing it back to writing the expression as an individual student writing the expression. Teachers have said to me over and over, oh, I so typically tell them what expression to write or what expression their picture represents. And so when all of a sudden they have these 4 choices, and when you think about it, some students do repeated subtraction for division. So they're like, oh, I subtracted 6, and then I subtracted 6, and then they circle 24 minus 6 because they're thinking about the repeated subtraction and not the actual, whether that expression actually is the final expression. So that connection, the making those explicit connections between the representations and the expressions and the context of the problem has been a great conversation when I'm working with 3rd grade teachers.
Yeah, that's a really big aha moment, that tying their strategies to the expression. Like that's a important step that they might have been undermining for their students, right?
Right. And we've seen work where students are doing repeated addition until they get to the 24. They start at 6 and they just keep adding and adding and adding, and then they'll pick the 24 plus 6. Mm-hmm. And so it makes so much sense why they're picking those expressions based on their strategy. But it's about representing that the full operation, and it's a much harder concept.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Janine, did you guys finish? Sorry.
Yes.
You want to pull up one of the 5th grade ones? We're all back together. We came.
Okay, great.
Because we figured Hillary actually.
Share that.
So could we do one more together, or how are we looking for time, Cheryl? Do you want to move
sure.
to the next one?
We can do another one if you'd like. We're finding it helpful if the person who kind of collected it gave it.
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
That's what we had Kathy talk, which is kind of why we decided to come back. Janine, I think we're seeing your wrong screen. I'm seeing your post survey. So we had Kathy kind of talk us through, we actually pulled up the other ones, not just the ones that were on the sheet. So Hillary, do you want to talk a little bit about, do you need me to share?
Do you want me to share?
I can share. It's fine.
I just did. Sorry.
I got it.
Is that good?
All right. Yeah. So this one, I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, Hillary, but this one I actually only took one because, well, see if you guys can figure out why you think I only took one of these examples. But Hillary did send, I think, 3 examples. So Hillary, you can talk about why you chose them as well. But if other people want to read through it. Sorry, not meant to be there. So, do you guys see what the mistake is here? Or is there a mistake here? Misconception, I guess. What I found interesting about this one is that a lot of the examples that Hillary sent were basically the same. The students basically got the answer correct, which they did in this one, but they almost all made the same mistake. So I thought it was a good example of the fact that oftentimes in a multiple choice, when in the other room, Kathy talked a little bit about how the kids were doing the math that they were assessing. They were doing exponents correctly, but when they, in their explanation, you could see that what they were the mistakes were actually in addition or multiplication of positive and negative numbers. But they knew, or subtraction rather, because it was division, but they knew exactly what they were doing. And this one is the opposite. Like almost all of the students, or a lot of the students got it correct, but nearly all of them made the same mistake of this 5 + 1. And the only reason I only showed one was because I think 3 of the examples that Hillary provided were the same, made the same mistake. And this one was just so much easier to read. Hillary, do you have anything to add to this question or things you saw, since you picked out a few of them, but most of them had this similar mistake?
Well, I'm a smidge confused. Why did you say 5 + 1?
The mistake here is, I guess they technically all have 5 + 1, is the kids all did -6.
Are we looking at different? I'm looking at the comparing decimals.
Yeah.
Wait, what?
Yeah. Hence my confusion.
I'm going to stop sharing. You share what you're talking about.
I was sharing what I was talking about.
No, I was sharing what I was talking about. Or I was sharing my screen.
No wonder.
There we go.
I'm sorry. So did everybody see your screen? Because it said it was shared. Did everyone?
Yeah. This is the first time I'm seeing this item.
Okay. That's an interesting part of the conversation. Let's see if we can try that again. So then this is an example of so many students picked the right answer, which is C, and they made the mistake of adding the 5 + 1. And one of the kids even wrote PEMDAS, which is the problem here, is that if you do addition before subtraction. But I think it's interesting that whoever wrote the problem, this is such a great mistake to make, is this addition before subtraction, or problems where students do multiplication before division, and they shouldn't, that it's such a great mistake to make. But in this problem, if you just gave it as multiple choice, shows kind of what you were talking about, you would have no idea that kids had that misconception.
Mm-hmm.
Does this make so much more sense now that we're sharing the right screen?
Yes.
So weird, because the green is around my screen. It showed me that I was sharing. Okay.
Yeah, this is a nice example of that, because sometimes when we give items or we look at items in the analysis part, the look for the math part, we're thinking, okay, well, there's a major misconception missing that we know about. Why didn't they include it? Or the misconception is such that no student's going to pick that one, or very few students are going to pick that one. So it's very interesting to analyze the items when you're looking at student thinking.
Right, and a lot of kids didn't get it correct I don't know that you would say for the wrong reason, right? Like they got 3 of the 4 correct, and the 4th one was correct enough, right? That it didn't make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Right.
All right, so then Cheryl, I think I'm going to pass it back to you. So
right.
we're going to look at one more, but I think we'll pass it back, and I will officially stop sharing.
Heather, sorry about that. We did have one park-related question that might be interesting to talk about now. It was asking about the item specs related to the park released item.
Specifically, like the evidence statements are staying the same because the items are staying the same. So as for the specifications, we never specified exactly how many of each question of each like evidence statement was going to be on the test, because it's based on probabilities. But we do specify how many, what am I trying to say? How many of each like item type is going to be there. So like 1.1, 1.2. And so that's the only thing that has changed. And I should be able to share.
Heather, this is Anne. So one of the wonders I have, because we're a smarter balanced state, and I know some of the things I have is what we call item specs, and it could be a different name, but basically it's an actual item prompt that's written out. And so when we're asking teachers to write items, they're actually following that exact prompt for the most part, except just maybe changing up some numbers, particularly for our procedure claims. Because we were just kind of getting into one of the questions that had some odd wording that could be interpreted different ways. So it was just more a curious question if Park does the same thing, because our teachers will like use those to create different practice problems.
I don't think specifically. I mean, Park has a lot of released items out there, and Park has a lot of practice items, and there are, descriptions of the items, but I don't think there's like a how to write your own item type of form, like a template. I don't think we.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Right. And one of the things, so at the session yesterday, at one of the takeaways, when I looked at the feedback, I was so happy to see so many people repeated what we kept saying all day was, it's not about the item, it's about the concept. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a nice way to think about, okay, so how would we rewrite this item so that it does get at that misconception? So after we do some instruction, we can see if students still have this misconception, because they're not very unlikely to see that item again unless there's a mistake. They will see that concept, and it can easily bring out the misconception in a way that will make them get it wrong. And so it's not about the item, it's about the concept, and I think that's a really just important thing that we just have to keep remembering.
That's
and
great.
Actually, none of the ones that were used by the group, because we actually, when we provided the link, we provided the link to some Park items to use, and then we also provided a link to like the main database, and actually all of these items were from the main database. Yeah. They weren't. So Anne, asking about the structure, these actually weren't Park questions, but we're hoping that people will use the Park items in the future as we build our own database.
Right. And I have to say that once teachers see and have access to the spreadsheet when they're already done, it's so much easier, and it's a great resource, and people are using it every day. So that would be great if you could build one. I did, when I saw the less than greater than sign, I had to pull this up because we had talked about sometimes there's a lot of less than greater than symbols on the assessments, and we had in one particular school, we had just talked about how students have such a hard time with it. And then this came across my social media page, and I just thought, how fabulous of the students to be able to write backwards like this. But it is, it's such a great point that students often want to read it from the greater than number, so they have a hard time with the less than symbol. So one of the things, it's again that it's about taking action. So when we see that in our student work, when we see they're having trouble with the symbol, then it's not necessarily about the trick about the alligator. It's not necessarily saying you're not going to use that, but it's saying after you use that, then always ask students, so what does this inequality say? How would you read this inequality? So that it doesn't stop at circle the bigger number. So it's again that takeaway. What's the takeaway that we're learning that we can all agree on as a collective PLC, that these are the things that we will always do, and we learn from each other and build this take action database. So as I mentioned, I do want to finish by really thinking about that take action piece a little bit more in depth. And one of the things that we're finding really helpful, and it started in one of our National Science Foundation grants. We were lucky enough to have 5 years and $5 million to study how teachers were thinking about using formative assessment in their classroom. And one of those things is eliciting evidence through probes. That's just one small piece of formative assessment. But what we found in that work and what we're carrying forward with this released item probe work is that by thinking about the potential responsive actions and sorting the work that way, it's a really good way to think about analyzing 25 pieces or 150 if you have a bunch of seventh graders, ordering or sorting the papers in a different way than we might have thought about before. So just in the chat, when I say based on the evidence, what responsive actions could I take, just type in, what do you think a responsive action could be? What does this mean to you at this point? For example, I could ask them a question, a follow-up question. But what are some other responsive actions? Don't see anyone offering any. Does anyone say one that they think? What are you thinking about when I say the term responsive action? No right or wrong answer here.
Kathy posted. Can you see hers, Cheryl?
I can. I wonder why not.
Okay.
Oh, small group. I see. I finally did. It popped up. Small groups.
There's actually 4 different answers there.
Great. Revising instruction, considering questions, small groups. Perfect. Showing it like an error analysis with my favorite no. It just took me a while to get it to pop up. So great. So when we're thinking about the responsive actions, what we like to talk about is there's really only 4 types of responsive actions that you can take. And by thinking about it in this way, it can kind of narrow your thinking and sorting the work. And all of these responsive actions really are based on the same question: how close are my students to where I want them to be? And so one huge part of formative assessment is having learning goals that you and your students both know, and having success criteria. And when you have the learning goal and you know what it's going to look like and sound like when students are meeting that goal, it's easier to answer how close are my students. And so when we think about how close are they, we can really think about 3 scenarios. We can think about, hey, our students are making good progress. Maybe I'm checking in mid-lesson or series of lessons. Maybe it's the end of the lesson, but they're making good progress. They're where I think they should be. Or, hey, they're not really where I expected them to be. There's something up here. They're not as far along. And then I'm really not sure where they are in their understanding. I don't have enough evidence. And so when we think about those the size of the gaps or whether there's a gap at all. When students are making good progress, that's the easy one. We move on to the next planned activity. Even if they're not perfect, because maybe it's mid-lesson and you're still working on the learning target. But they're making progress. I see that they're doing fine. I'm keeping on going. I'm moving on. And then when I'm not sure, that's where we want to gather more evidence. And what we're really talking about here isn't when we can see some of their thinking and we want to ask questions. This is really when you really are not sure, you didn't gather the right evidence, or they didn't respond in the way that really let you know that they could do it. Maybe they all went in a direction that you weren't expected, or a lot of students are saying, I just knew it, I did it in my head. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about here, where you just don't have the evidence that you can determine the size of the gap. And so when they're not making the progress that's expected, that question that we have to ask is, how big is that gap? And so if it's not very big, they're really close, that's when we are going to think about our responsive action as providing feedback and closing the feedback loop. And if it's really big, there's just something going on here, we need to work more on this, that's when we are really going to provide more instruction, either at that level, or we have realized that that learning target's not the appropriate learning target, and I need to go back and instruct at a more foundational level. And so thinking about where is the majority of my students when I'm looking at student evidence, and it doesn't have to be on a released item probes, but it's just how we have been thinking about our first sort of our class set of probes. How many students are in each of these piles? So, for example, when we think about this, the example that I had shared earlier, we've been working on comparing fractions a lot in this particular school who offered to do the work. And here's an example of the learning target in which we were looking at the student work. So how are fractions compared? Can I use what I know about the size of the pieces and the number of pieces to compare? Can I use the numbers and symbols to show the relationship? And so thinking about where are my students at, what's the evidence in their work on how close they are to meeting those criteria is how we think about that first sort. So that's the easy part though. So because what happens is that you have different students in different piles. And the next piece that we've been really working on, and it's been really exciting, is if you have enough students in your feedback bin, and even on your move on bin, and not that many in your need more instruction or need more evidence, then this routine has been a wonderful routine for teachers. And we are starting to gather some videos around this, but here's the basic idea. You give the enhanced multiple choice, that's just what we call the probe, because it's a multiple choice with an explainer to show your thinking. And then you sort through those papers, the ones that have errors, and you find 2 to 3 that you want to share and create as an error analysis routine, just like somebody had wrote in the chats that you could do something similar to like a My Favorite No. And when you choose those 2, some of the teachers are using Google Community, some are just projecting them, some are actually copying them. It just really depends on how far they are along in the different environments that they use. But during that instructional time, students work in teams to find the errors and discuss and fix the errors. And then there's a whole class facilitation of what errors were found. And then 6. So 6 is the key. That's what's closing the feedback loop. You could have done all that error analysis and all that discussion, but without closing the feedback loop, you're not going to get the results that you may have hoped for. And that closing the feedback loop is actually returning the students their original item to them so they can fix their own paper. and do that revision. We do so much revision in other content areas, and we want to have that revision mindset in mathematics as well. And so what we're finding is even students who had the correct answer can revise and make their justifications much more robust, and can really enhance their justification based on that error analysis. This routine does not work if all your papers are in the needs more instruction bin. Unless you do instruction before you do the routine. So again, it's choosing the right routine or choosing instruction based on where the majority of your students are. So this routine, as I said, we're starting to gather videos and things because it's been really a great conversation. And so this is just a picture of a math coach actually presenting the routine to a bunch of grade level teachers are in the room, and the math coach is showcasing how the routine works. And so you see the students working on the error analysis, and then you see her doing the group facilitation. What this particular school is also doing, which is really a nice action research project, is that they are doing pre-post analysis in grade level groups on how are students doing pre and post the routine. And so you can see this is just one example of how they graph the baseline and then they graph the revision, and they put it into categories of correct with sound justification. The yellow, the no errors in the justification, means that the justification could be enhanced, but there were no visible errors. And then correct or incorrect, but mostly sound reasoning, because students, though I know not all of you saw the line plot example, but it was a great example where students had some really sound reasoning, but they didn't have the correct answer because of the way they interpreted the problem. And then also that, hey, these students still have incorrect reasoning. And so this particular math coach works with several schools, but they get the grade level teachers together, and they all choose what probe to do. And together, they do more on their own, but they have 4 per year that they do together so that they can collect this data. But the conversations that they're having are just fabulous. And at the end of one of the videos of the PLC, one of the teachers says, "I think I'm learning more than my students are learning." and it's great because it's just this great way to talk about student thinking without just saying, did they get a 0, 1, 2, or 3, and how did they score? And so please ask questions about this. I know we're near end of time, but I want to leave that time for questions. So please ask any questions as you want. So as I said, we typically have lots of students in each of our buckets. So, if most of them are making good progress, we're going to continue on. If we have that real range, equal numbers in those buckets, then we really need to think about that differentiation. And if most are not making the expected progress, then we're going to provide that instructional, additional instruction. But no matter what, we still need to differentiate for the few that are in those other categories. And so we really want to think about, how can I get the majority of my kids continuing on, and then pulling those kids where I need to differentiate. Or the other way around, I'm going to get students learning something at a prerequisite idea, and then I'm going to differentiate and push some thinking for those students who are already there. So it's not easy. There's always great discussion. And in the Oklahoma work, what we started to do with those discussions was just summarize it in teacher notes. And some of you might have looked at those examples where what are we taking away from these discussions around these looking at student work and thinking about responsive action, and especially more instruction. What can we take away from that? What are important ideas? There's some links to like applets and resources, but if you can work together in a community, whether it's virtual community or at your school, it's amazing the resources that we can pull together as we're talking about the concept behind the item that we're analyzing. So again, I wanted to leave a couple minutes, I think we have, in case there are questions, and it's hard to do. So like this is session 2, and you can see why often when we're doing this cycle, it's an ongoing piece, and we often work 30 hours with a group of teachers rather than the 2 hours. But I think I hope this is a great launch for you for ideas on what you might do in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Cheryl. Do people have questions? Cheryl, do you want to stop sharing your screen so then we can see everybody? See if anybody has. Does anybody have any questions? Because what we find that happens, I just want to throw this out there, is people say, everybody says they don't have any questions, and then they start to wait for people to log out, and then they ask questions, and their questions are good enough that they would have been useful for everyone to hear the answer to. So all of you that are thinking about that, you can share your questions.
Hey, Cheryl, this is Anne.
Yes.
So I'm curious if any of the teachers you're working with, how they're using this with like specific intervention groups, or if they have like like a math instructional specialist that actually works with a specific group of students. Do you have any, have they been using these around supporting those kind of structures in schools?
Yes, they definitely have. And that's why the spreadsheet kind of came about, because we had special educators and interventionists who are trying to support and get to the root cause of the issue. And they may be doing a 5th grade probe in the 5th grade class, but in intervention, they're really working on 3rd grade concepts so it's not about necessarily using an 8th grade probe with an 8th grade student who's struggling. It's about, hey, where can I find in the same cluster of the Common Core, but move down to maybe 5th grade just to see where they're at, what I could build on to get to them to that grade level. And so we've been working on that in with our special educators mostly, but also with our Title I educators as well.
Okay, great, thanks.
How often should we be doing these? One of the things is like, how many do you have? And it doesn't have to be a sample or released item either. So what we're really strongly encouraging our educators to do is start the year with at least once a week where you're using an enhanced multiple choice item. And then as you get closer to mid-year, or closer to whenever your assessment is, then making sure that you're using the sample or released items rather than your own items, just so students have that comfort level. We're finding, so one of the things that the schools that we work in our grants with, they can say on the day of the assessment, they can say things like, okay, remember that we've been really working on error analysis and thinking about multiple choice questions and how you have to think, and you might have to actually do some math on paper to get to your answer. It's not a mental math just because it's multiple choice. But today you're going to do your multiple choice selection on the computer, and your thinking is on your paper. But it's what we've been doing all year, and we're finding a huge difference in the numbers of kids that were just going A, B, C, and not actually trying to think and do the math, represent the math that they needed to do to answer that multiple choice.
Is Maine's test 100% multiple choice or machine score?
It is mostly, but not all. There are at least 4 to 5 constructed responses on the assessment as well. So we have another whole thing on that.
But this is useful. I mean, the more you get your kids to talk, the more you can get your kids to write. The more you can get your kids to write, the more that they are to the constructed response.
Right. Yes.
So I just want to say thank you. If you have other questions, feel free to email Cheryl, or if you email them to Janine and I, we will try our best to answer them and contact Cheryl if we need to. I'd love to give her a round of applause, even though she can't really hear it, but everybody can applaud from their own room. And thank you so much, but we do want to value everyone's time so that you can go be more stir crazy in your house that you're probably stuck in. And Janine posted twice now. We really do need you to fill out the post survey. So please do this. This helps us. This helps us show impact so that we can keep offering programs like these. And it also provides us feedback. Almost all the ideas we've had in the last 4 to 5 months has been based on requests that have been from the post survey. So please do that, including inviting Cheryl. So thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you.
I hope it warmed up for you.
Thanks.
Well, it's snowing now, so great.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks. Janine, you want to stop the recording?